Notice the file contains a list of names to avoid. Let me check it and then write the story. Names to avoid: Ruth Calloway, Gerald, Lily, Donovan, Margaret Harlow, Edna, Craig, Claire, Beverly, Vivian, Spencer, Patricia, Ruth, Dennis, Nadine, Deirdre, Eleanor, Marcus, Serena, Theo, Lorraine, Arthur, Sandra, Francis. The first time he asked about the house, I didn't think much of it. We were sitting on the back porch, my daughter and I, and he was standing near the railing looking out at the yard, the old oak, the garden beds I'd been keeping since 1987, the detached garage that used to be my husband's workshop. It was a Sunday in early October, that particular kind of afternoon where the light goes golden and everything looks a little more valuable than it is. He turned around, smiled the way he always smiled, easy, wide, practiced, and said, "This is a beautiful property, Miriam. What does a place like this go for these days?" I told him I had no idea. I wasn't in the market. He laughed. My daughter laughed. I smiled and went inside to refill the lemonade, but I noticed, that's the thing about being 67 and having watched people long enough. You notice, not in a paranoid way, just in the way that a word lands slightly wrong, the way a pause goes on a beat too long. Something in the question was off. Not rude, not obvious, just tilted. My daughter had met him 8 months before that afternoon through a mutual friend at a fundraiser downtown. She was 41, had been divorced for 6 years, and had been, I say this with nothing but love, a little lonely in the quiet way that people who are used to managing everything alone go lonely. She didn't advertise it. She wouldn't. She got up every morning, took her kids to school, ran her consulting practice, called me on Sundays, and somewhere in the middle of all that competence there was a space she'd stopped talking about. He stepped into that space like he'd been measured for it. His name was Callum. Callum Reeves. He was 46, newly relocated from Atlanta, said he was in commercial real estate development, drove a clean gray SUV, and had the kind of face that made people want to trust him before he'd done anything to earn it. Friendly, without being loud. Attentive, without being obvious. He remembered small things. She'd mentioned once that she liked a particular kind of tea, and 3 weeks later he showed up with a box of it. He asked her daughters their favorite colors the first time he met them, and brought small notebooks in exactly those colors the next time. My daughter fell in love with him, I think, not so much with who he was, but with the feeling of being seen. After 6 years of being the one who saw everyone else, someone was paying attention to her. I understood that. I didn't fault her for it, but the house question stayed with me. The second time he brought up property, we were at dinner. Just the three of us. A Tuesday night, she'd made pasta and he brought wine, and he steered the conversation toward real estate in the area. Mentioned that property values in our county had climbed almost 30% in 4 years. Looked at me and said, "You must have a lot of equity tied up here, Miriam. Have you ever thought about leveraging that?" I said, I preferred to think of my home as a home, not an asset. He smiled and said, "Of course, of course." My daughter changed the subject to her older daughter's school play. But there it was again, that tilt. The third time was different. He didn't ask me directly. My daughter mentioned, casually, almost in passing, the way you mention something when someone has coached you on how to bring it up, that Callum had suggested they look into some investment opportunities together. And wasn't it interesting that my financial advisor had recently retired? And had I thought about consolidating some things, maybe with someone who really understood the current market? I put my coffee cup down. "What kind of investment opportunities?" I said. She named a firm I'd never heard of, said Callum had worked with them before, had seen good returns. "I'll look into it," I said. I never looked into it. I called my bank instead and quietly moved my primary account to a new number. Old habit from my years in HR. Document first, react second. I want to be fair to my daughter here. She is not a naive woman. She has an MBA and runs a business and reads contracts before she signs them, but love has a particular way of rerouting intelligence. Not because you become stupid, you don't. You just start applying your intelligence to defending the person rather than evaluating them. Every concern becomes a misunderstanding. Every red flag gets a reasonable explanation. She wasn't being foolish, she was being human. And I was being her mother. which meant I was watching things she couldn't see because she was standing too close. Callum proposed in March, 7 months after that first Sunday on the porch. He did it privately, just the two of them, at a restaurant she loved. She called me from the parking lot, crying, happy crying. I want to be clear, the kind of crying that sounds like relief. I told her I was so happy for her. I meant it, with the part of me that wanted her to have exactly what she deserved. The other part of me sat with the phone in my lap after we hung up and felt something cold settle in my chest. I am not a suspicious person by nature. I taught middle school for 22 years, then spent 12 more in school administration. I have dealt with children who lied, parents who lied, occasionally colleagues who lied, and I have developed a reasonable tolerance for the fact that people sometimes do things for complicated reasons. I don't assume malice. I investigate first, so I started investigating. Callum Reeves was not hard to look into once I decided to look. His professional history was patchwork. The LinkedIn profile was polished but thin. Employment gaps smoothed over with vague consulting descriptions. The firm he'd worked for in Atlanta had dissolved in 2019 under circumstances that a local business journal had written about briefly. A fraud complaint filed by investors ultimately settled out of court with no admission of wrongdoing. His name wasn't mentioned in the article, but one of the investors' names was, and I found that person, a retired contractor in Marietta, through a Facebook profile that was still public. I sent him a message. I explained I was trying to verify someone's background before a family matter. I was polite. I didn't expect a response. He responded in 20 minutes. What he told me, I will not repeat in every detail because some of it is still difficult to think about, and because my daughter eventually had to hear it, and the hearing of it was hard enough once. But the outline, Callum had inserted himself into that man's family through a business relationship, had gained access to accounts, had moved slowly, months, more than a year before anything disappeared. By the time the contractor's family understood what had happened, the structure of it was so layered that recovering anything through legal means took 2 more years and cost more in attorney fees than they recovered. I sat with that for 3 days before I did anything else. My daughter was by then deep in wedding planning. They'd set a date for September. She'd asked me to help with the flowers. We'd gone to 2 tastings. I had watched Callum sit across from her at those tables, attentive and warm and completely present, and I had thought he is very good at this. I hired a private investigator on a Thursday, a woman named Jean who worked out of an office on the east side of town and had been recommended by a friend of a friend who'd used her in a custody case. I told Jean what I knew and what I suspected. She told me her rate and her timeline. I wrote her a check and drove home. I did not tell my daughter. This was the hardest part. Not the investigation, the silence. Every Sunday call, listening to her talk about centerpieces and venues and which dress made her feel most like herself, and knowing what I was doing on the other side of the week. She asked me once, around May, if I'd warmed up to Callum. I said I was still getting to know him. She accepted that. She was gracious about it, the way she is gracious about most things, and I hated myself a little for the space between what I was saying and what I knew. Jean came back to me in 6 weeks. Callum Reeves had a pattern. 3 women in 12 years, 2 widows, 1 divorcee, all of them financially comfortable, all of them with properties or portfolios that represented decades of work. The relationships followed the same arc: charm, commitment, engagement, and then a slow legal entanglement. Documents signed under the assumption of shared future, accounts restructured with joint access, and then, in 2 of the 3 cases, the relationship had ended before marriage, but not before significant assets had been transferred or made vulnerable. The 3rd case had ended in a short marriage and a long, expensive divorce. None of the women had pressed criminal charges. In 2 cases, Jean said, they'd been too ashamed. In 1, they simply hadn't understood fully what had happened until too late. I drove to Jean's office and sat across from her desk and looked at the folder she put together. "What do I do with this?" I said. "That," she said, "is up to you." I had 2 options as I saw them. I could go to my daughter directly, show her everything, sit with her while she processed it, and trust that she would make the right decision. The risk there was that I might lose her. not permanently. But love does strange things to loyalty, and there was a real possibility that confronted with this, she would choose not to believe it, or worse, believe it and resent me for the delivery. Callum had, I now understood, likely been quietly framing me as overprotective, as a difficult mother-in-law, as someone threatened by his presence. Small comments, I suspected, dropped over months. I had no proof of that, but I knew the architecture of it. The second option was to wait, gather what I could, and let him make a mistake I could document. I chose a version of both. I told my daughter I wanted to get to know Callum better, and would it be all right if the two of them came to dinner every other week for a while? She was delighted. Callum, to his credit, didn't blink. He came to those dinners with wine and easy conversation and what appeared to be genuine pleasure. I began leaving certain things visible. I'd leave the folder from my financial advisor on the counter, reference my brokerage account and conversation, mention the property value without being asked. I got a mailer yesterday. Apparently this neighborhood is up again. Must be worth quite a bit now. I watched his attention sharpen each time just slightly and then smooth back over. In July, he asked me over dinner while my daughter was in the kitchen whether I'd ever considered adding a name to the property deed. For simplicity, he said, estate planning, that sort of thing. It's something they recommend now. I said, who recommends that? He smiled. Just something I read. I'll ask my attorney, I said. I called my attorney the next morning and made sure everything was absolutely locked, beneficiary designations, deed, account access, all of it. I also asked her what, realistically, could happen legally if someone attempted to falsify a document in my name. She walked me through it. I took notes. In August, something changed. I noticed Callum becoming slightly less patient at the dinners, a fraction of a degree cooler. The wedding was 6 weeks away, and I believe, he understood that I hadn't moved the way he'd expected. The access he was building toward hadn't materialized. He was recalculating. And then, the second week of August, my daughter called me on a Wednesday evening, not a Sunday. Her voice was quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. "Mom," she said, "can we talk?" She drove over that night. We sat at my kitchen table, and she told me that she'd found something. A name in Callum's phone. A woman. A number of calls. Texts. She hadn't meant to see but had. She wasn't crying. She was the way she gets when she's trying to think through something painful before she lets herself feel it. I made tea. I put the folder from Jean on the table. We sat there until 2 a.m. She didn't say much at first. She read. She asked me a few questions. She went back and read again. At some point, she put her face in her hands, not because she was surprised, I think, but because there is a particular grief in having what you knew, somewhere deep down, confirmed on paper. "How long have you known?" she said. "Since March," I said. "I didn't know how to tell you." She nodded. She didn't blame me, not then, not later. I think she understood, even in that moment, that there is no good version of this conversation. There is only having it or not having it, and she was grateful, eventually, that we'd had it. She called Callum the next morning and told him the engagement was over. She didn't explain. She didn't owe him an explanation. He showed up at her house that evening. I was there. He was very calm, very measured, and he tried 3 or 4 different approaches: concern, confusion, wounded dignity, and finally, briefly, something that was closer to anger before he caught it and repackaged it as hurt. He asked to speak to her alone. She said no. He looked at me once, just once, and I understood in that look that he had known from the beginning that I was the obstacle and that he had simply underestimated how long I would be patient. He left. She changed her locks the next day. The women Jean had found. I reached out to 2 of them, through Jean, carefully. One agreed to speak to an attorney about documenting her case properly. I don't know what came of it. That wasn't mine to follow. I just wanted someone who knew the pattern to have the names on record. My daughter took a few months to grieve it. Not the man, exactly. She was clear-eyed about him fairly quickly. What she grieved was the version of the future she'd let herself believe in. The dinners, the trips they planned, the particular feeling of being chosen. That takes time. There's no shortcut through it. We planted a garden together that fall. Her daughters helped, mostly by making a mess of things and laughing about it. My older granddaughter asked why we were planting so late in the season. I told her some things take longer than expected to find the right ground. She accepted that with the confidence of a 10-year-old who has not yet learned that most answers are incomplete. I looked at my daughter across the garden bed, her hands in the dirt, her face turned up toward the afternoon light, and I thought about the porch and the October Sunday and the tilted question and all the Sundays after. I thought about the long patience of love, which is not the same thing as passivity. I thought about 22 years of watching children who were not my own learn hard things, and then 12 more years of watching the adults around them, and then 67 years of being a person in the world who pays attention. I thought about the look on his face when he laughed, the brief flash of something real under all the practiced warmth. I am not a suspicious person. I am simply a person who has had enough time to learn the difference between a question and a test. He was testing me that first Sunday. I just waited longer than he expected to show him the result. I've thought a lot about what I would have done differently. And honestly, not much. Not because I got everything right. I didn't. I waited too long to tell my daughter what I knew. In those months of Sunday phone calls, listening to her talk about flowers and venues while I sat on information that could have spared her some of the grief. I still carry that. I'm not sure I'll ever fully stop second-guessing the timing, but here's what I've come to understand about the way things unfolded with Callum. He was counting on a very specific version of me. He needed me to be the kind of mother who either didn't notice or didn't act. He had, I suspect, encountered both types before. Women who sensed something wrong and talked themselves out of it. Women who saw the signs and told themselves they were being unfair, that they were the problem, that love deserved the benefit of the doubt. He had built a method around that particular human tendency, the tendency to distrust your own instincts when trusting them would cost you something. I am 67 years old. I spent 34 years working in schools, which means I spent 34 years watching people. Young people, mostly, but also the adults around them, learn what happens when you ignore what you know. I watched children fail tests they were prepared for because they second-guessed their first answer. I watched parents defend choices that were costing their kids because admitting the truth would have meant admitting they'd missed something earlier. I watched colleagues let bad situations drift for years because confronting them required a kind of patience and precision that feels, in the moment, like more trouble than it's worth. What I learned from all of that is something I'd put simply: acting on what you know when you know it and in the right way. That is not cruelty. That is integrity. It is one of the hardest forms of it because it requires you to hold two things at once: love for someone and a clear-eyed refusal to let that love make you blind. My daughter is a good woman. She is smart and she is capable and she wanted something real, and Callum understood that want and used it. That is not her failure. That is his. The people who operate the way he operates rely on goodness. They cannot function around cynicism. Cynicism spots them immediately. They need people who genuinely believe in other people, and then they exploit that belief like a resource. What stopped him wasn't suspicion. It was attention. Patient, sustained, undramatic attention. I did not catch him in a single dramatic moment. I just kept noticing, kept asking the quiet questions, kept following the small threads until the whole picture came clear. And I think that is the thing worth sitting with, wherever you are and whatever situation you're watching unfold around you right now. Not paranoia. Not assuming the worst of everyone who comes close to you or the people you love. Just paying attention, trusting the small, uncomfortable feeling that something is tilted. Not performing certainty before you have it, but not abandoning what you know just because the knowing is inconvenient. My daughter and I planted that garden in October, late in the season. Some of what we put in the ground that afternoon didn't come up until spring, but it came up. That's the thing about doing the right thing carefully and at the right time. You don't always see the result immediately, but the result comes.